The best test for whether I'll end up sinking hundreds, or even thousands of hours into a game, is if moving around in an empty room feels fun. Two games that I love that embody this gameplay are Celeste and Rocket League. And there's one factor that I think it comes down to: player expression. But what exactly do I mean by player expression? Well, let's start by looking at Celeste. Say you're in an empty room with some terrain, and you want to get from point A to point B. You could do this, or even this. At every given moment, there are many options for how to continue. Similarly, in Rocket League, there are endless ways to get the ball into the net. With both games, you can give two players the same goal, and they may do two completely different things. That's player expression, the freedom to approach movement with creativity. So how do you actually design for something like this? For the past few months, I've been making my own platformer with expressive movement from the ground up, and I'd like to walk you through the design process. I started with a few simple moves: a jump, a slide, and a grapple that can shoot in one of 8 directions. Nothing too interesting yet, so how can we expand on this? Every way of performing a new move can be broken into roughly one of 3 categories. The first is moves that execute when you press a button. This is great for frequent moves that form the foundation of a game, like our jump, slide, and grapple, since you want something simple for the players to perform. However, the drawback with adding moves this way is that too many buttons becomes overwhelming very quickly, especially in a platformer, where the emphasis is on smoothly translating a player's intentions to what their character performs in-game. So, I opted not to add any more binds. Instead, I focused on 2 other types of moves, which I'm going to call context-dependent and sequence-dependent moves. Context-dependent moves require a specific environmental state to be performed. For example, a wall jump requires that the player is in the air and near a wall. So the jump input performs a different action than when you're on the ground. It's context-dependent. On the other hand, sequence-dependent moves are moves that execute when you perform a certain set of inputs in a row. A classic example of this is special moves in fighting games. With this in mind, we have a blueprint for building out expressive movement. At each moment where the player's options feel limited, we can ask ourselves, is there any unique context or interesting sequence of inputs that allows me to add a new move here? As we do this, the decision space gets more complex, and the player can be more creative in their approach. So where did I start with my game? Since the character resembles a frog, I wanted to add a move that makes you feel springy. I felt like a natural choice for this was bouncing off surfaces when you grapple into them. But instead of making this perform automatically, we can require pressing jump as the grapple ends to initiate the bounce, turning this into a sequence-dependent move. There are 2 upsides to this. The player has autonomy over whether or not they want to bounce in any situation, and, like a lot of sequence-dependent moves, there's a nice rhythm to it. This mechanic was inspired by the Bounce Helper mod for Celeste, which allows you to dash into a wall and then press jump to bounce off of it. One interesting quirk of Bounce Helper's movement is that dashing diagonally down into a wall gives an upward bounce when you'd expect it to send you downwards. I'd imagine this is because being sent downwards in a platformer doesn't feel great. You already have gravity pulling you down, and there are usually hazards below. At first I thought I'd take the same approach, giving the player an upwards bounce, but then I realized there was an important distinction between my game and Celeste. We have the slide. With the slide, downwards bounces become useful because you can chain them into high ground speed. With the bounce, I felt like I was on the right track, but all the choices are centralized around the grapple ending. Meanwhile, you have no control during the grapple. All you can do is sit and watch until you reach your target, which is pretty boring. So I gave the player 3 ways to interrupt the grapple. The first 2 are bounce and slide canceling. If you're adjacent to a surface while grappling, you can press jump to bounce, giving the same trajectory as bouncing after a diagonal grapple. And if you're adjacent to specifically the floor, you can press crouch to enter a slide, giving a ton of ground speed. The idea is that both of these moves reward thinking ahead with your grapple placement, and add an element of timing as you pass by where you'd like to exit. But they're both context-dependent moves. If you're not near a surface, you still have nothing to do while grappling. So I decided to let the player jump left, right, or straight up out of the grapple. I think being able to choose which direction you jump makes it feel more like you're ejecting yourself from the grapple, and less like it's flinging you out. Now at every moment while grappling, you have multiple decisions you can make, and this does a ton for player expression. At this point, I turned my attention to the beginning of the grapple. I noticed that if you grappled down diagonally while standing on the ground, you'd instantly begin a slide with no real feedback that the grapple happened. My solution for this was to take the grapple spin animation and force this a bit before you can begin your slide. At first, this was just a visual tweak to smooth out the transition, but since the spin animation is used during the grapple, it felt like the movement while rolling should parallel the movement while grappling. We can already slide out of the roll, but we can't bounce out of it yet, so let's add that. But there is one big difference between rolling and grappling. While grappling, you're forced to move in one direction, but with the roll you can switch directions because you're moving freely on the ground. So it wouldn't make sense to base the roll's bounce direction on which way the grapple started. Instead, what felt most intuitive was for the bounce direction to be dependent on which way you're facing while rolling. And this adds another opportunity for expression, because you can choose which way you're going to bounce mid-roll, while also providing some leniency if you accidentally roll the wrong direction. I liked the roll so much that I extended it to the ceiling, and even though the ceiling roll had all the same properties as the floor roll, something felt off. It felt like there was some force counteracting gravity to stick you to the ceiling that immediately disappears when you roll around a corner. So to give the roll more weight, I added a fling around corners as this imaginary force dissipates. And like the bounce direction, I made the fling direction dependent on which way you're facing, which, if you turn around mid-fling, makes for a really satisfying way to scale one-tile-high ledges. At this point, the movement felt like it was coming together, because I was starting to discover unintended interactions that felt really nice, such as bouncing off the side of a wall while rolling around a corner, or rolling up multiple corners like a staircase. And this happened naturally as I added moves with the goal of maximizing freedom, because the permutations of sequences or contexts that trigger a move just kept increasing. Discovering all these new interactions made me realize how satisfying the corner fling felt. So I added a similar fling around corners when rolling on the floor, and even though it makes less physical sense, it makes rolls consistent between the floor and the ceiling. And more importantly, it's a lot of fun. At this point, the movement felt like it was at a great place, so I got some friends and family to try it. From the feedback I got, I scrapped this mechanic where you could bounce after landing from a grapple jump because everyone found it too confusing, which is also why I glossed over it until now. But in its place, I added one last mechanic. One of my playtesters suggested that it could feel nice to have a way to move perpendicular to the grapple direction. At first, I was worried this would give the player too much power, making it impossible to build gameplay. But limiting the move to a small snappy range around the grapple made it feel very balanced. Now you can weave between hazards mid-grapple, or even correct your alignment if you're a little off target. And just like with rolling, this move came with a ton of interesting emergent behavior. Since you can now reach surfaces from further away, the wiggle added a lot of leniency to bounce and slide cancels. There's also this maneuver, which lets you fling yourself past a corner. You can even use this to bounce on a different surface than what you grappled onto. Like in this section, where I wiggle downwards so I can bounce off the ceiling to immediately enter a slide and then jump out of it with the speed from the bounce. Or you can wiggle into a wall to interrupt the grapple and bounce in the opposite direction. Basically, the wiggle increased the options while grappling drastically, without feeling too broken. And with that, we're done. The movement feels simple to pick up on the surface. There are just a few binds for moving, jumping, grappling, and sliding. But there's a lot of hidden depth that gives you room to be creative in how you approach an obstacle. It feels super fun, which I'm really happy about. If you enjoyed the video, please consider subscribing. Next up, I'll be building out everything needed for a full level, including hazards, one-way platforms, non-grappleable surfaces, and some level editing tools. Then we can see how all this movement plays out in an actual level. In the meantime, I was considering posting an extra video going into the hidden leniency that makes the game feel smooth, or a video detailing how I made some of the visual effects, especially the tongue physics simulation, which was a lot of fun. I'm just not sure whether those are topics people would be super interested in, so if either of those are something you'd like to see, let me know. And of course, thanks for watching.